Okay, first things first, it is clear that your manuscript, in the whatever, what's written in it,
Hmm.
is way more regimented than what you had described or what you've tried to play so far. I mean, it's really has a sense of who talks when, and is all very what is designed. That's the word I want to say.
Hmm.
And that's fine, but it also, in my opinion, is ahead of itself. It's, I mean, the certainty of what it looks like on the page, uh,
Hmm.
I think needs to be uh, thrown into useful doubt. Maybe it already is in your head, but it's kind of
Hmm.
like, it looks like a draft of game instructions, which is,
Right.
I'm
Yeah.
kind of like, I'm not so sure we've got a game for instructions yet. Um, so if we have a group of people
Hmm.
and we're going to talk about the math, um, what you focused on is the fact that all the cards are going to get moved around from
Hmm.
person to person, and you did, and correct me if I'm wrong. I'm saying this so you can check me on this.
Okay.
If you do it by machine according to several different assumptions, um,
Hmm.
one of the best news is that they don't all uh, go into full even spread, right? They do not,
Right.
right? In other
Right.
words, you will still have certain things. I mean, how am I going to put it? You will still have a certain percent of non neutral results, right? Non
Right.
randomized results,
Yeah.
and which is good, um, because how am I going to put it? As all card players know, the whole point of shuffling is that it doesn't create an absolutely randomized, or rather uniform distribution of suits and numbers through the deck. If it did, then nobody would do shuffling.
Right.
Right. The point is
Right.
not that they are uniformly distributed throughout by any
Yeah.
variable. The point is that you don't know what clumps are where.
Right.
Right. So that I think is your, if you're preserving that principle, then we're using cards for what they're for,
Hmm.
because that's the one thing cards can do is
Yeah.
is clump up all the distribution of what you're going to get in ways that no one knows. That's
Yeah.
what they do.
Yeah. Let me explain how I ended up with cards because what this used to be, right, what it started out as was dice. You pre-rolled these pools of dice. And then what happened was is that you do, and in fact that little that little demonstration I told you I did where I ran it with like a couple of people, it was still in that form. And so I had gone into Roll 20 and I'd set up a screen with all the dice like pre-rolled just so that we could get to it real quick. And I realized there were 100 dice on the table. And I was like, but I've been thinking about that ever since.
Right.
And so I said, oh, but it'd be way more manageable. So I know that I was sacrificing some true randomness because obviously, with dice, you could get all tens, whereas, 1 through 10 repeated 10 times, there's only 10 tens in the deck.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So they're not mathematically equivalent. But that was mostly the reason to shift to the cards was that I realized, holding 10 little cards in your hand is way easier than stacking up 40 pools of dice in front of
Well,
you.
you see, I think in this case it's very much a virtue in terms of the other factors of cards. And I'm not
Mm.
necessarily talking about what you just mentioned, which is true, but
Yeah.
not that
Yeah.
important. Whereas, I mean, it's not like I'm going to be benefiting from how am I going to put it? It's not important to me that as a
Mm-hmm.
player that I have the same chance for X every single time we roll dice. That's not an
Right.
important
Yeah.
part of what's going on. In fact, I
Mm-hmm.
suggest it's rather the opposite. That, as I said, we have to remember that there are two meanings to random. There's the mathematical meaning of random, and
Mm-hmm.
then there is the colloquial meaning of random. And that cards do the colloquial meaning of random very, very well.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And so, and dice confound people a lot because they're expecting the colloquial meaning in play, but they're getting the mathematical meaning, which they didn't want. Right.
Right.
And that occurs, that's a big deal actually in gaming. So
Yeah.
in our case, I do want to call attention to the fact that as the cards are, passed out, basically, as everyone
Mm-hmm.
gets their cards, if we
Mm-hmm.
even just go by the numbers, they're not going to be evenly distributed. The sum of the numbers in this person's hand are not going to be the sum of the numbers in this person's hand, right? They're
Right.
not going to have the same range within a given hand from hand to hand, etc. I could go on, but the point being is that we are going to have some weird um, ordinary in terms of playing cards and dealing them out to everybody.
Right.
Ordinary in that sense, but mathematically, graph wise, it's a weird, like, chaos theory bumping, of
Right.
distribution of whatever happens to be in everybody's hand. And so,
Mm-hmm.
and then the net effect of moving the cards around as written is
Mm-hmm.
not going to change that. In fact,
Mm-hmm.
as perhaps black cards become more common across various different people's hands, or as certain other other factors,
Mm-hmm.
somebody plays off a lot of little cards, and so statistically they may end up with skewed toward higher cards or whatever, right, as they get more cards. As all that is occurring, the incomplete information persists, and that's what matters. The incomplete information. Now, it's different
Mm-hmm.
because each individuals know what they gave to a given player, right? I mean that
Right.
if two players exchange cards in those one-on-ones, or I believe the GM at the end of one of the big rounds, then puts cards back into a player's hand, stuff like that.
Right. Yeah.
Um, so one person knows, but the other people don't know. If I'm not mistaken, the other people don't know.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So that
Oh yeah. I mean the other. Yeah. I mean most people. The majority of the table is blind to
right.
any one exchange of cards. Really.
Right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Now
Yeah.
this is a very good thing. This means that the cards can play their role of landing on the other person in an exchange or in a
Mm-hmm.
dialogue, landing into the fiction in a fashion that's a change up for them. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
because that's what we're really looking. This is what I really want to focus on today.
Mm-hmm.
Not the huge engine of play through multiple rounds, multiple
Sure.
delves,
Sure.
multiple
Yeah.
narrations and outcomes. I could say in a somewhat flip way, save that for your processing, in your grand meetup, right? Here, I
Right.
want to focus on what's going on inside play,
Okay.
right? And what do numbers have to do with it?
Mm-hmm.
What determinants do they have? How do they relate to talking? What sort of
Mm-hmm.
talking goes on before the cards get revealed or played?
Okay.
So tell me a little bit about that as you see it.
Okay. So there's really two two major instances, which is the confrontation that takes place in the dungeon environment and the confrontations that may take place in the flashback. So, is there one you would rather me focus on
Let's
first,
let's take them in
or
order.
okay, take them in order? Okay, yeah, because you're more likely to do the ones in the rooms first. And so we're just finished a flashback, right? So we've had some sort of scene content for this character, right? and the adversary GM, as he's called, um, picks something, right? Either out of the flashback or revive something from a previous encounter, um, and brings that into the fiction. It's that moment that I described before, where it's like the toy
Yeah, no,
bobbles
I'm
to
on it.
the
Yeah.
surface.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Or
And then he plays a card, right, representing the. It could be a physical threat or even just the cycle. Like this is the stress of seeing this toy, right? Then, without saying anything, the and actually no, wait, I take that back. The adversary does that for all the players.
oh, that I did not know. This is actually
Yeah,
happening simultaneously across players.
that's what's a little difficult to
Aha.
describe in my thing. So he does that for the first. So if we had 3 players who all just finished their flashbacks, right? They all had their flashbacks. The adversary does them in parallel. He reveals something to one, he reveals something to another, he reveals something to the third. Okay? Then going back to the first, the player flips over a card, so they see the comparison first, and then it's almost like sort of like in Troll Baby, you get to narrate your own failures. They see whether or not, oh, this thing is overwhelming me, or I'm defeating it, and then they describe what that looks like to them, right? Because in some ways, I want them to be able to kind of describe their own punishments. They're like, what,
So,
like,
in other
what
words,
is the
right?
yeah
They
yeah
describe the impact that it has on them, but do they also describe if they overcome it and how? So they narrate no matter what at this point.
yes
Okay, got it.
yes
That's what I thought I
yeah
heard.
they would
Now,
they either defeat it or they
Mhm.
don't, right? Or it's a setback, right?
right.
Um,
Now
it really should be initially it should be either progress or setback because the outcome has not yet been determined at this point. So
sure.
it should be either like yeah.
But
Yeah.
to clarify the numbers issue, the game master, the adversary GM, has not chosen these cards at random out of their
No, they can see their
right. And the same thing goes with the player. They look at that and then they'll put one down.
No, they just flip the top
The
card.
player just flips the top card, so there's no. So
Yeah.
for them, it's statistics based on what's in there.
Yeah.
Okay. So now okay, that's actually quite interesting. It's so much. I like it's the opposite of sort of the standard use of cards in 90s role playing games where the GM flipped a random target number and then people played out of their hand. It's reversed. Okay,
it's reversed. Mm-hmm. Yeah. No. So the player. Okay. Then, the adversary, and then each player does that, right? Responds. Then the adversary essentially can keep going, right? Could be like, oh, I'm gonna, and he doesn't have to do it evenly. He could say like, he could look at one player and be like, no, I'm done with you, right? And play only second rounds with the other 2. But basically, that process repeats up to 3 cards for the adversary. Like he only gets the maximum of 3 exchanges. Again, not necessarily he basically he can, I don't know, for lack of blackjack term, he can stay on at any point. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then you look at the final results. Like once the adversary says, "Okay, I'm done," right? Everybody looks at the final results and then narrates the final outcome of, are they overwhelmed in some way or injured in some way, or did they did they defeat the thing? Did they chase it up? The worst I could imagine happening at this point would be like some kind of like injury.
Okay.
Got it. Maybe even blacking out, like being knocked out and you just wake up somewhere else. Like, death is not on the line, but like the worst thing that could happen is,
Okay.
Yeah. Is injury or,
Now, here's another thing. The cards then get redistributed or taken over or sequestered in some way, right? The player is not going to get back the cards they played.
Right.
And the without going
not for you. Yeah, because they do. Because you look at which side won, and you take those cards and put them into your latent psyche, which is the pool you can't play from.
Right. So
you do get them back, but not for immediate use.
Exactly. That's what I mean. You
Yeah.
don't just
Yeah.
refresh. So
Right.
with that in mind, um, I would like to know whether the fictional consequences will carry over in any way except qualitatively. In other words, there is no, for example, well, I'm injured, so I get one less card or something like that.
Right. There
Right.
isn't anything like that.
Right. So then,
The,
mhm.
mhm. No, go
well,
ahead.
well, the, the
Yeah.
the main issue that I'm after, and I think I can see exactly how I can tie it together with the big issue, the big question in my mind.
Hmm.
Um, what I'm after is that consequences in terms of final outcomes for those characters
Hmm.
will ultimately not be numerically relevant. I mean, the judgers, those who judge, um,
Hmm.
will be doing so regardless of whether the player got a lot of victories or whether they got a lot of defeats through the course of these things. Ultimately, the judge is saying, well, victory or defeat, how did they handle it? What kind of person are they?
Right.
Now,
Yeah.
this leads to, I think, my biggest question that I'm trying to tie it to this, you see.
Hmm.
Um, Simplistically, one would say, you got to have damage, man. What about hit points? Okay. But, and both of us, certainly can say, all right, yeah,
Yeah.
sure. But, and we're right about that. But there's something they're right about too. There's something
Hmm.
they are right about. And I'm going to tell you why I think so.
Okay.
Without something which
Hmm.
is understandable as causal and consequential from the numbers inside the scenes,
Hmm. Hmm.
then ultimately all you're basically doing is trying to placate and plead with these two judges, one of which is cursed with malevolence and one of which is cursed with fairness. And I say cursed with fairness, given the way that you phrased it in the game. You're basically trying to please them. You're basically trying to
Hmm.
say, see, I'm not such a bad guy, or
Right.
I've suffered enough. Can't you take a break on me now? Or
Yeah.
something like that. And it is fully disempowered.